Wonderful. It's so good to see everyone. Hello, and thank you all for your patience. A little technical snafu here, and we're waiting for our plenary, so we're going to get started. We've got lots to talk about, and we will welcome Hemi when she's able to join us. So I want to remind you all that this webinar is really part of our Capital Conversation series, where we provide a unique opportunity to hear directly from key policymakers, leading experts, and Lutheran Services in America staff about the latest policy developments and their implications. So today, on the heels of the implementation of H.R. 1, which was the big, beautiful bill passed earlier this year, and in the throes of the shutdown, we are already seeing changes in state budgets related to Medicaid and other important programs. So today we really hope to hear from Hemi Tewarson, who is the Executive Director of the National Academy for State Health Policy, which we effectively call NASHP. And she's going to really share about what's important to watch and how best to engage. But we're going to start off our conversation by hearing from two of our members from Lutheran Services in America, Tom Syverson and Amy Moore, about how really their multi-state organizations are navigating the current landscape. And then we'll be joined by Hemi. But first, I'd like to turn it over to Sarah to provide a framework for our discussion.
Thanks, Alicia. And I do say that we're joined by Hemi now, so we can begin as we plan. But first, I'd like to do, before we get formally started, we do want to ask folks to participate with us in a very quick one-question poll that helps us gauge your level of knowledge and engagement on H.R. 1, especially Medicaid changes. We'll do this very briefly, give folks who are on a chance to respond. Just looks like a couple more people. And we may have some internal folks who aren't, doesn't make sense to participate. Okay. We'll give it 5 more seconds. Okay. So here I'll share, can you see that? Share our results. We've got, looks like 1 person with strong understanding and can explain it to others, 11 with good understanding, and then majority of those answering, 21 have basic or limited understanding. So it's good that we're here to talk today. So, but first, before we get into the meat of that discussion, we did want to share a quick policy update about what we're seeing at the federal level right now. As I'm sure everybody knows, the government shutdown is continuing. It's now tied for the second longest of the government shutdowns, which is not exactly a distinction we're excited about. That was in the December of the first Trump administration. The House is still in recess. They've said, look, we passed a funding bill. It's up to you in the Senate. The Senate has made 11 attempts to pass that bill, and none has passed the 60 vote threshold to overcome a filibuster. We have seen some movement. There is a group of House moderate Republicans who had previously supported some Medicaid funding and positions that were significant to our network. A group of them has sent another letter to Speaker Johnson signaling they want to pass an extension of the ACA premium tax credits immediately upon the ending of the shutdown. They're still towing the party line of saying we don't want to couple this with the vote on funding, but this is very important. We're seeing this impacting our district. So that may be a chink in the armor. But the impacts are continuing to build and ripple outward. The SNAP program, which is sometimes known as food stamps, formerly known as food stamps, is going to run out of funding to provide to the states in about 2 weeks, a little bit less now. And then a lot of nonprofits, as some of us have talked about, many rely on federal grants and contracts, and they're facing we are facing mounting financial strain. And the ripples are just continuing. The longer it goes on, the more paychecks that federal employees and those related miss. Then we have seen one bright spot, the Road to Housing Act, which is a bipartisan Senate bill introduced by Senators Tim Scott and Elizabeth Warren, who lead the Senate Banking Committee for the Republicans and Democrats, respectively. Thus, this is the first major bipartisan housing bill in over a decade, and it includes 40 provisions aimed at expanding housing access, improving affordability, and increasing federal program efficiency. It's now passed in the Senate as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a must-pass bill every year. And in the House does not have an equivalent housing bill to the Road to Housing Act, so they didn't include it in their version of the NDAA. But the hope is, as negotiations move forward between the House and the Senate to finalize the final NDAA package, that this housing provision will remain in. And then finally, just of significant note, the Supreme Court is in session as of the beginning of the month, and they're hearing a major case which could have a potential huge impact, reshaping House district maps ahead of the midterm elections next year. They're considering this case that could weaken part of the Voting Rights Act that relates to whether or not states are allowed to create majority-minority districts. And if that is thrown out, that could significantly impact the map and because there's a number of competitive seats that are really in play, and the House is very close in terms of the number of Democrats and Republicans. This could shift competitive seats away from Democrats, who tend to perform strongly in those types of seats, and that could really throw a wrench in the cycle. It could really impact if the Democrats have the potential for taking the lead and managing the House in the next election. So with that, I do just want to remind everyone, please join us to stay informed on this work and all the other advocacy work that our public policy team does. We have a link here, and you'll be receiving that in your follow-up materials, to join our advocacy subscription list, which is how we send out emails with updates like this, calls to action, invitations to join us in our advocacy work. And we also would love to have you, if this fits your work, to become part of our Advocacy Leads engagement group on our community platform. This is for anybody that's interested in diving into conversations on advocacy and policy, if you're the point person for advocacy work in your organization. So if you've already joined us on community, please go ahead and add yourself to the group, or if not, you can always ask for an invitation to join community, and we'll help you make sure you get where you need to be. So with that, I will turn it back over to Alicia, and we'll have our discussion.
Wonderful. So I'm going to welcome our guest speaker, right? Yep. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Getting back into the track here. So I want to very much welcome, Hemi, who, as we said, works for the NASHP, and Tammy is going to tell us what she is seeing and the impact she's seeing in states across the country as a part of the HR1. So Tammy, I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Hemi, sorry. No wonder you didn't know who I was talking about.
No
Sorry.
worries. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you. And I know hold on, you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, I want to make sure. I'm getting this message about unmuting my mic. I know I had a few slides. We can use those or we cannot use those, whatever works for you all. So I guess I should ask that question. Do you want me to show the slides, or do you want?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, so you want me to?
Yep, and we'll make sure you're a co-host.
Okay, so let me just get those. I wasn't sure if you guys were gonna hold on. Okay. 1 second. I think Hannah sent them to you, so hold on.
Yep. Yeah, we've got them too. If you need us to share them.
Yeah, do you mind, just because?
No, absolutely.
Okay, that'd be great. That I can just not. So I'll just get started, and I'll just, I want this to be a discussion. So I'll just, plan to talk for like 15 minutes or so, but, we'll pause, ask questions, raise your hands, put things in the chat. I want this to be a discussion. So, because this is really for you. So a couple things just about NASHB. I've worked in state health policy for a long, long time. Gosh, I don't want to say how many years, long time. At NASHB, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with all 50 states in the District of Columbia. We can go to the next slide. And our mission is really understanding where states are in their work to improve health, and also to then figure out where can they go next. So we're really in a really interesting time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this as states look at, frankly, their own state budgets, which really drives a lot of the work that they do, but then also the changes at the federal level and how those are intersecting and where they're prioritizing right now. And it's really evolving, frankly, and will continue to, I think, over the next 1 to 2 years. So we can go to the next slide. Just to give you a sense of who we work with a lot of different types of state leaders. I think that's what's unique about NASHB. So, we work with the executive branch, and you can see all the folks listed here. But we also work with legislators and folks in between, like insurance commissioners who are, maybe independent. So I think it gives us a really interesting perspective on the work that we do. We just had our large annual conference in September in San Diego, and really heard a lot firsthand from state leaders about kind of where they are in all of this. Okay, next slide. Just in terms of what else we do a lot of different things. We convene states. We also do a lot of policy brief and analysis. We do tracking about what's happening across state legislative efforts on certain topics. We do draft model legislation. We're educators, not lobbyists. So it kind of depends on the topic. If states feel like they need some help, outlining ideas, we do that through draft legislation. And we really think all of our work really needs to be evidence-based. So we're always thinking about how do we help states understand, particularly in moments like this, why the different policy ideas that they're moving forward make sense for their state, for the people they're serving, and for like other partners across their state. So we can go to the next one. So what I wanted to do today is really just outline a little bit about the One Big Beautiful Bill, or HR1. I like to call it HR1. And it sounds like, the majority of you all are familiar with this, so I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts of what it does. But I will say where we're really focusing, obviously, are on the health provisions and the Medicaid space, but also the marketplace space. So that's where I'm going to talk about today. I will say it's really interesting, when this was actually getting debated, people were like, oh, states are going to go into special sessions and it's all going to be over the healthcare stuff. Some did go into special sessions, but the biggest driver, frankly, to go for special sessions was the tax changes at the federal level that states had to conform to. I'm not a tax person. We're not going to talk about taxes on this call, but there's different drivers. And it's just, I think, a reminder of like how big this bill is and how many different changes are impacting state budgets overall. And health is a piece of that. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So this is where I wanted to spend a little bit of time. So like, what are state leaders really thinking about with respect to the Medicaid changes? And if, feel free, if we want to go deeper on anyone, like on community engagement or provider taxes or state directed payments, these are all changes that states are going to have to implement in the next many years. We can do that. But a big picture is like, where are they in all of this? They have been spending a lot of time about like, what are all the different requirements related to Medicaid and marketplace that I have to understand for my state, and frankly, SNAP as well. There are a number of different changes in the bill. And as a result, particularly on the Medicaid side, they are going to have to make pretty large investments to actually change their systems. Community engagement, just to talk about this in a little bit more detail, has introduced a brand new way of thinking about Medicaid eligibility that we've never done before. And it's really challenging. So it's, I think all of you are probably very familiar. It's going to require folks to either be who are, adults, who either are exempt because they're caring for children, they're disabled, they're medically frail, they're, different categories, mental health, substance use disorder, diagnosis or treatment. They're exempt for those reasons, or they'd have to meet 80 hours a month of work, volunteering, education. So what's really tricky about this is the person has to, if they're not exempt, has to meet that 80-hour-a-week requirement before they actually become eligible for Medicaid. So that is going to be a whole new way of thinking about Medicaid eligibility. And, states are concerned that consumers are not going to meet all those requirements or understand how to meet those requirements, and then they will lose coverage. And that has a whole ripple effect, which you see in this sort of next bucket. What does this mean for insurance coverage, and how do we maintain pathways? So another requirement that states have to implement is they have to redetermine folks every 6 months. We all went through the pandemic where there was no redeterminations. Everybody stayed on Medicaid. The rolls, really increased. We had a lot of people on Medicaid. We have a lot of people on Marketplace. But now in this redetermination phase, they're going to have to prove that they continue to be eligible for Medicaid every 6 months. And that's going to kick in 2027. So just as a result, states are thinking about, like, one, how do we implement this? And I'll just say a couple of challenges that states have is their state capacity. You all know this. States have to balance their budgets, whether they're on a 1-year cycle, 2-year cycle, or some are in a 4-year cycle. They don't have sort of extra money they can just, save for another day. They have to show how they're justifying their costs. And so as a result, none of the states we've talked to are going to be able to staff up in the way that they think they need to for all of these operational changes. So that's like one big challenge and limitation. The other piece is they have to really upgrade their IT systems. Part of on the community engagement side is thinking about how do you do this without asking the consumer to give them information? How do you do it on an ex parte basis? Like look at databases and figure out, are they already working? Are they volunteering? Are they in education? Do they meet an exemption? Just, can you check things so you know that so they don't have to actively tell you that? Great in theory, hard in practice. And I will just say, because you all, this is an amazing, organization that has, I think, over 300 organizations that work in health and human services. This is where we have to, I think, be creative. And I hope you all are going to partner with your states to think about some of this. Because where are the resources for volunteering? There isn't a national database. There isn't an easy place to check. So how can states put that together? Can people self-attest? Does that count? These are the questions states are grappling with right now. Another area is education. There's lots of opportunity for education, but there isn't one database. So states have some of that. They have their state universities and whatnot, but they don't have everything. So that's another area states are thinking about, just like, where do we go for data matching? Like, what's going to be the way that we can do this in an effective way? And then on the working part, many Medicaid beneficiaries are working. Like, we know that, we've seen the data, but they often have maybe 2 or 3 jobs. They may not always be getting the payroll stubs that they can easily produce. Some are gig workers. Like, there's all sorts of things that are coming up in this space. And so then the question is, how do they verify employment for these folks? Does their state labor department have the right data sources? What's missing? How do we think about this? And then so those are all the active, like, they don't meet exemptions, work and community engagement. I think the other piece that they're thinking about is the exemptions, because I think there's a lot of concern that if folks don't do the right things to show they're exempt, or states don't check the right places, there are people who should be exempt who are going to lose coverage. So, thinking about, like, if someone's a caregiver, how do you effectively document that? Where does that go, especially if they're like a family caregiver? How do you think about people who have a mental health or substance use disorder? How do you ensure that, a parent of like a really complex, a child with complex needs, certainly gets exempted out? And what I think is really interesting that sometimes people aren't aware, some of the categories that existed for Medicaid, like you were disabled, or you had, you were a parent of a certain income, many of those people moved to the expansion population when states expanded Medicaid, because states could get the higher match, and it was sort of an easier pathway to determine eligibility. So they're all going to be subject to these new requirements now. And so how does that work? So I think there's a lot, we feel very strongly that states are not going to be able to do this alone. They have got to be partnering with community-based organizations and providers and trusted resources, because that's where people are going to go for help and understanding of what all needs to happen. So that's one, I think, piece I wanted to be sure to share with you all. The other piece I would say is the timing of like where states are right now. At least this folks that we were talking with, they're in the like, we have to make policy decisions. They do not have final federal guidance. So they're guessing right now at some of these, at the answers to some of these questions. And that's a risk, right? They don't want to sort of build out a whole set of policies and IT changes and then have the federal government tell them, nope, that's not going to be okay. So that's the uncomfortable place we're in now. I think they're pushing for CMS to at least give them some informal guidance to help them, feel like they're on the right pathway. But at some point, they're going to just have to start going, because we're 15 months and counting to January 1, 2027, when this community engagement requirement kicks in. And that's like, actually, it sounds long, but that's a really short time frame for procurement for states to actually make IT changes, make big policy changes. So it's really not a lot of time, and they really need to be working on it now. And then the last thing I would just say, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the other priorities aside from sort of community engagement and redetermination, et cetera, is making changes to their program. There's like a lot of work that was like underway, and I know you all were a part of this in your various communities. Like post-pandemic, there was a ton of federal money flowing to states. State budgets look really good, and you saw a lot of like immersion of new ideas and new policy. People really invested in like home and community-based workforce and services. They got down their waiting lists. They thought about new types of practitioners and Medicaid coverage for those, like community health workers and different types of practitioners in the behavioral health space, peer supports. You saw lots of Medicaid waivers, right, that allowed states to cover lots of different social determinants of health services, supportive housing, nutrition, thinking about those who are incarcerated, getting Medicaid coverage for them before they're released. So there's a transition. So you saw a lot of that innovative policy because that administration was really pushing that, and states embraced it, and they had the budget to do it. We're in a very different time now with state budgets. I won't say not all state budgets are terrible right now, frankly. It really is depending on where you look. But I think there's a concern in this, pursuant to this last bucket of as their changes become more and more readily impactful for states, you're going to see in the next 1 to 2 years those budget forecasts changing. So I do think there's in that kind of environment, states are having to justify what programs they keep in place, how they keep their investments, like what's the return on investment, if we don't, invest in service, will we have costs elsewhere? How do we justify that to our legislators? So that's at least at NASHB how we're talking to states about their work, because a lot of these areas are really good investments for not just long-term health and outcomes, but also on what you're spending on sort of acute healthcare services overall. So that's just a conversation that we're seeing. And then in terms of like everyone asked me this question, like, are they going to cut benefits and provider payments and services, like, and people, like, where are states going to go for all these cuts? I will say so far, the few states that have had to make changes are doing it to provider payments. And that's, you see North Carolina, you probably are, if you're following North Carolina, what's happening there. They call it the 3-8-10. It's a 3%, 8%, or 10% cut to your provider payment, depending on what tier you fall in, because they had to make up a $300+ million budget deficit for their Medicaid program. You see Idaho and Indiana, where the governor has said you have to have in Idaho 3% cut across your entire agencies, Medicaid included, but also beyond Medicaid. So the way the Medicaid agency is making up for that is provider payment reductions. That's same true in Indiana. So that's, I think, where folks are going first. And I do think states are concerned about that because they're saying like, okay, we're cutting provider payments, but there's also going to be changes in coverage. So the combined effect on certain providers and community-based providers in particular in rural areas and otherwise is really concerning, and how destabilizing is that going to be? So just wanted to I know this isn't an uplifting conversation, but just wanted to share just what we are hearing so that you all sort of better understand. And it depends on the state and, what they're specifically focusing on, but that's certainly a piece. I'd say the other piece I wanted to talk about people are talking, at least in our circles, are talking about home and community-based services and concerns around changes to that with respect to, you know, higher, like longer wait lists, not being able to provide all those different services. And so figuring out like where that may land and how to talk about these investments is really important. Okay, so I can keep going for a couple more minutes, and then I want to make sure we have time for questions and engagement. Okay, we can go to the next slide. See, I'm forgetting what we have next here. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about rural health transformation, just so we can talk about, this is like top of mind, just primarily because the application's due November 5th for states. So like they're heads down, really trying to get this work done. For those of you that are not familiar, it's in HR1, it's $50 billion over 5 years for all 50 states, presumably, if they all get approved for their applications. And the things I wanted to just share is there's the 25 billion that really we expect if states submit an application that meets the basic criteria and, you know, they don't screw it up, frankly, you know, all 50 states should get a portion of that money. The second half of the 25 billion is much more competitive. And that's really focused on, there's some metrics that states have to meet, like, you know, how rural are they? You know, what's their Medicaid disproportionate share hospital payment footprint. There's a couple of different metrics that they have to meet that's going to advantage some states that are frankly more rural than others. Like Rhode Island isn't going to fare well in that calculation. And then alongside with that, they're going to be evaluated on different criteria of what programs they're actually proposing to use that 25, whatever their portion of the 25 billion that they're going to do. And so that's where I wanted to talk about some of the ideas that are like we're hearing about. There's a lot of ideas swirling. There was just new guidance released from CMS last week on this that unfortunately said they couldn't do some of the things that states wanted to do, like loan forgiveness and whatnot. That was taken off the table. But states are still thinking about like what's transformative. Like this isn't meant for payments to go to rural hospitals. That's really clear in the guidance. There's a cap on, you know, payments to hospitals at 15%. And that's CMS has been telling that us and the states from the get-go that that's not what this is for, because they want to have it sustainable. And they really feel like rural hospitals and rural infrastructure needs to change. So some states are really looking at what is provider transformation, thinking about like cross-system community health workers, for example. They're thinking about different types of workforce and thinking about like training programs, like in the maternity care space. Maternity care deserts is a really big challenge. So a couple states have been thinking about like, do we have new training programs for non-OBGYNs to help them understand, you know, what they're able to do in terms of where they are? Do we invest in that? Can we invest in like broadband and IT infrastructure for our rural providers to help them connect, like, you know, really strengthen our hub and spoke model? That's like innovative to them. And that's like upfront investment. That's not necessarily just a payment to a provider that has to continue on besides the, you know, outside of the 5 years. That would be like upfront. Value-based payment structures. Can we help people get there with technical assistance and think about where to go? Chronic disease management, like are there different tools and ways to really address chronic disease management? And some states have thought about regional approaches. I think that's going to be harder because they don't have a lot of time. So really like getting sort of states together in a regional way and like coordinating across their applications. I'm not that hopeful that that's actually going to come to pass given the deadlines. The other thing I just wanted to note here is it really is CMS is going to be tough on these reviews. And that's what is holding some states back, frankly, because CMS has said, if you put out something like you're going to change scope of practice, or you're going to change your certificate of need laws, or you're going to like have a whole new infrastructure for your rural hospitals, and you're going to help them, you know, transform into other entities. If you don't do that by the milestones you set out, we're going to take money back. So states are taking this really seriously. And I think as a result, at least for some of the ones that we've talked to, they're like, we're not going to put in these things we were originally going to put in because we don't want to have to give money back. That's going to be a problem for us. So we're going to be really conservative and go really much smaller because we don't have the confidence we're going to get there. Other states are like, this is the best, you know, best thing that, you know, we could do for rural health. We're going all out, right? We think we can do all these things. We have the political will at our back in our state. Like, we're going for it. So it really does depend. You know, one state's like, I'm going to go like do global budgets for my rural hospitals. I'm like, that's big. So anyway, that's just to give you a sense of kind of the range, and we'll see when the applications actually are submitted where they are. And hopefully you all have been involved in your various states in some way, shape, or form as they think about their application. Okay, I guess I should just stop and see if anyone has questions about the rural health piece or the Medicaid, community engagement, HR1 changes before I talk about anything else. Any
Sure,
questions?
thank you, Hemi. And this is Sarah again. I see we have one question in the chat. Someone asked, what was that you gave a 15% figure related to rural hospitals, and what was that?
That was the overall part of the funding that can go to rural hospital payment. That's a cap.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
And then a couple of questions from us here in the room, and anyone on the call, feel free to use the raise hand feature or post a message in the chat, and we'll be happy to incorporate that. I had a question on the engagement piece, just knowing that our members are the providers, they're working with folks in their community. What would you see as a helpful or a key first step for organizations like our members as they try to engage as partners to ensure access to care, or ensure, just from the very baseline, people who really are qualified are doing what they need to do to get and stay qualified, and then helping those that may have fallen through a crack?
Yeah. So, I just want to think about or just mention how important community-based organizations were during COVID, and how many of you, I think, or hopefully did partner with thinking about getting information out to consumers. And there's a couple of examples post-COVID where there's been social services programs. I just call out North Carolina being one of them. In those instances, it was so key to have the community-based organizational support for funding, for organization, and for engaging consumers, to get them to the right referrals. So I feel like that's a key piece to build on. I hopefully you all have some of those relationships at the state level. They need to hear from different local organizations and think about how to organize the efforts, both to meet the requirements of the new HR1, Medicaid eligibility pieces, but also to think about some of these other social service programs and where people can go who may no longer be eligible for Medicaid, who may need access to other types of services, whether it's housing or nutrition or transportation. We were just talking about immigrants, for example. A number of them are going to lose coverage on the marketplace side because they're not going to qualify for subsidies anymore, as well as on the Medicaid side. They are going to need help figuring out where to go, right, for different types of services. So that would be, I think, a piece to talk about. The other piece I would say is thinking about, populations that are, children with complex needs, just as one example, or aging populations, helping just from a community level, helping states understand what the needs are locally, I think is really going to be important. And I say that because there's so many people are coming to them with all the things that are, could happen that they're really concerned about. They're having to prioritize, where do we focus? We have a supportive housing program over here. We have this nutrition program over here. We have this, we're investing in community health workers or these other types of workforce. We need to have CBO investment in these areas, helping them understand here's where we are and here's how things are evolving, so that they have the ideas and the ways to then navigate how to explain the priorities to their legislators who are going to talk about sort of budget, with a very budget lens on how things are going. The other thing I would say is, you all are going to feel, I think, changes, right? We're all going to feel the changes when they start coming into effect. Being able to articulate what the impact is at the local level, and with personal stories, and really tell the stories with data and, live examples, I think it's going to help, because that's where I feel this is what we're doing on the marketplace side. It's it feels very up here, oh, there's all these people who are no longer going to be eligible for tax credits, but here's who they are, and here's why it matters, and here's what the effects are going to be on communities. So, which includes providers, stability, thinking about sort of broader economic impact of different communities. Sorry, long answer, but
No, but helpful. So thank you, and appreciate all the great information that you've shared. I'm going to give one last opportunity if anyone else, either live or in the chat, wants to ask an additional question. And other than that, we'll say thank you so much, Hemi. We really appreciate you having been here and talked with us. And we're now going to turn to two of our member organizations to talk a little bit about what they're seeing locally and at the state level for their impacts.
Thanks.
And I'll
Thanks,
turn it to
Tracy.
Alicia to lead that discussion.
Wonderful. So thank you, Hemi. Really appreciate that. And you know, we've been talking about the forces at play, the HR 1 changes, the Rural Healthcare Transformation Act, which we're all trying to figure out, I think she referenced, and the shutdown. And so we are joined by two of our guests today. Tom Syverson, who hails from the Good Samaritan, based in Sioux Falls, that has a large footprint in the Midwest, as well as Amy, who hails from Ascentria and their Northeast presence in several states up in that area, and really going to share. We've got some questions, and once again, to reiterate what Sarah said, this is an interactive conversation. Raise your hand. We got someone monitoring the chat. This is your opportunity to kind of ask questions of your peers and understand what they're seeing and take a deeper dive. So first of all, thank you both, Tom and Amy, for being with us here today. And Tom, I'm going to start with you. Given your work and the Good Samaritan work on aging-related issues, can you tell us about some of the policy changes you're following at the state level, especially related to changes to Medicaid? I think you mentioned telehealth in our prep call. And, what's really causing the most disruption and potential disruption for your work and in what you're doing?
Sure. I think Hemi did a great job of highlighting two states that have taken action already. Another state that we happen to be in, we're in 8 states in the upper Midwest, and one of those states is Colorado. There, they did call a special session. The legislature kind of punted on the cuts and told the governor to make the reductions. So we did see a 1.6% reduction in our rates that we had just received during the normal session in Colorado. So that's just another example of how these cuts are starting to happen. And I do want to say one thing. There's been a lot of discussion touting the fact that long-term care, skilled nursing was carved out of the provider tax reductions. However, as Hemi pointed out, states still have to balance their budgets. And so it really depends on the state. And once you've seen one state, you've seen one. We're in the Dakotas, which do not have provider taxes, but do have Medicaid expansion. So we're dealing with that on our hospital side with Sanford Health. But then we have other states that either have just recently implemented either new hospital-directed payment programs or have increased the provider taxes on the long-term care side. I think there's a lot of uncertainty with that, and probably the state that I am most concerned about, and I see a few people from Minnesota on the call, is Minnesota. There, I don't have a lot of confidence that the 1.5% increase for skilled is going to actually get approved at CMS. And there's also a brand new directed payment program that also, they did a preprint on it, but I still am a bit concerned there with that as well. So those states that are now impacted by budget shortfalls that are created through this, I think are the ones that are most at risk. At the same time, in Minnesota, we have new mandates that are going to increase our wages for all staff. So I think that's really going to have a devastating impact on our rural providers in the state of Minnesota. So it's unique in each state. I think that's one thing that you have to be thinking about. And I think monitoring what is going on in each of your states is critical, because things can really change quickly. And there's even impacts now. North Dakota had a special hearing with their legislators. They're going to have a special session because they only meet every other year. And they were looking at the policy issues with the $50 billion transformation funds. We've been engaged in those conversations in all of our states, and it really varies, to Hemi's point. Some are being much more aggressive. Some of the smaller states, like the Dakotas, are going like, how do we spend $100 million? And it's one-time money. So I have a lot of doubts about how transformational that can be when you can't have ongoing funds and it needs to be sustainable. I think there's other states that feel, being more Democratic-led, that they're not going to get any money. Well, I did hear Kate Sapra, who's the deputy director, at the recent NRHA conference. She said it's mathematically impossible for states not to get money in that second tranche of dollars. So her goal, what she said, was to make sure every state gets the dollars that they deserve. So don't let that slow you down. And finally, I guess the other thing that I'm really prepping for is moving from 90 days to 60 days with the retroactive payments. So we are actively seeking out opportunities with third parties to really work with our families more independently to try to help them navigate the Medicaid system and get their applications done correctly. One of our associations actually has a new member service that they're providing as well to try to help with that. So those are some of the things I would say high level.
Okay, well, that's not a very short list, Tom, but thank you.
There's more. I could go on.
Yeah, I think it speaks broadly to the place that we're on, but really keeping working in close partnership with your states, anticipating particularly areas where there's a projected shortfall, knowing that that's gonna, no matter what's kind of being said at the top about skilled nursing and other those areas, that there's that opportunity, that tension between the cuts and some of the additional regulations that can increase costs. Definitely there. And then I think that your observation about thinking, I hope everyone is watching on what happens with that healthcare transformation. Like there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of conversation about it. So, and potentially opportunity. So thank you. Amy, so you're in New England. A little bit east of South Dakota. And, can you really acquaint us with what you all have been seeing since the enactment of HR 1 and just in addition to these other factors that we're talking about?
Sure, yeah. So we are in 5 of the New England states over here, off to the east of Tom.
Mm-hmm.
But truly, Tom really hit the nail on the head, because it's, especially where I am, there's such a difference state to state. And I know there's 2 of us at Ascentria right now who are doing advocacy work, in charge of advocacy and trying to keep up with the day-to-day in each state and all the programs we have. I mean, that in itself, right? So trying to stay on top of things there. And some of the states is just so different from state to state. New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Wow. In New Hampshire, we had, prior to the bill even passing, the New Hampshire legislature, the House was trying to pass a 3% cut to all Medicaid programs. So right there, we ended up meeting with every senator and Senate Finance before the budget went there, because that, before that had even passed, we were going to be running into problems. And then, in Massachusetts, it's really just meeting with all of our legislators and letting them know our concerns, the people we serve, what we're expecting. At Ascentria, we have our Services for New Americans program, unaccompanied refugee minors, and these cuts, like especially to SNAP, looking at what that's going to do. Speaking of SNAP, we have SNAP Ed program in Massachusetts. It's just phenomenal, and supported over 31,000 people this last year alone. And what that's going to mean for folks. So there's some carryover funding, at least in Massachusetts, for SNAP, so that we can keep that going for another 7 or 8 months. But it's just so much about getting together. I think providers, we have to be working together. I'm so grateful for the LSA community, because we have to be working together to get that word out. In New Hampshire, it's very tough, but we have a huge kind of grassroots coalition, New Hampshire Needs Medicaid, that's been working together for some time. And we've had webinars, press conferences, op-eds, just really to educate folks about what's coming, and then meetings with our DHS, our Health and Human Services, our partners there, to talk about how can we help you. We're in a lot of these homes, we're out here in the community. How can we work together? Because there's no way that they have the resources needed to get this information out there. So how can we all work together to do that? Because we're in the homes, we're in the community. Same thing in Maine. We have Maine mental health services, which are so important. And where they're located in Lewiston, Auburn area, there's a huge immigrant workforce. Well, there's this ripple effect, right? And we're really trying to kind of, I guess if we can't come at it we're not getting across with like, this is just the humane, the right thing to do is to take care of your neighbors, right? Look at like the healthcare workforce. We're trying to come at it from a workforce perspective of what this is going to do, and really watching all of our messaging, because healthcare, right? So you think that changes to home and community-based care and Medicaid won't affect you. Well, it will affect you when you bring your loved one to the ER, right? We've already been seeing that. We went through that with COVID. So really talking about that system of care and that ripple effect and what that's going to mean. But I think the partnerships are just so incredibly important, and working together to support each other. One thing that we just actually this week in Massachusetts, we were able to submit a budget amendment, and we're trying to look for funding for resettlement agencies to help support with status adjustments and housing stabilization. So that was something where there was some potential bipartisan support. So looking for those little glimmers where we can get something in. In New Hampshire, it's a lot of defense and just really educating people and banding together as providers. So I think each state is different as far as how we approach it, but the one common thread is that we have to be coming together and working collaboratively. In New Hampshire, when this was first started, we all, hospitals, all of us providers just met one night in this big conference room and started talking about what resources we had, whether it was in marketing communications or another, and how could we pool those resources to work together, because frankly, it's terrifying and we have to help support our people. So yeah, a lot of triaging, I guess, but the collaborative effort is going to be so key. That was another long answer, but yeah.
Oh, no. And that's a really good, to a follow-up question is, Tom and Amy, both your organizations have capacity in the advocacy and education areas, right? Your larger organizations. And you've spoken a little bit about what that looks like, but what advice would you offer your peers about what they could be doing at the local and state levels to inform discussion and debate without sort of a dedicated function?
You want to go
Tom,
first,
we can start
Amy?
with you. Yeah.
Do you want me to go? Okay. Yeah. So I would say we actually had a couple years ago, we had great success in New Hampshire. We were at a point of having to potentially close our home and community-based care because of really a lot of neglect in the funding space. And one of the things that we did was we, again, came together, approached a bunch of other organizations and worked together collaboratively. We're able to get a little bit of, some grant money from an organization. And we went out and we just joined forces and started telling the stories. Just, Hemi, I was glad you said that earlier, telling the stories of the people that were affected. And I think that's something we're really going to need to do, right? We're out there, we know the stories. And we, in New Hampshire, we actually took those stories and we would match them up. If there was a certain patient or consumer that was in the same district or the same town as a Senate finance member, we would bring that story right to that Senate finance member. We were on conservative morning radio talk shows talking about how home and community-based care was the fiscally conservative option, right? But getting those stories out, banding together, we don't, at Ascentria, a large organization, we don't have a lot of advocacy resources, but there again, working with your partners, we're all in this together. So how can we use our collective voice? That's where we're going to have impact, and storytelling with that data, of course, is key for sure.
And I think Amy said that really well about building coalitions, because you are only stronger when you're working together and have a united voice on issues. The other thing I would really suggest is getting engaged with your state affiliate of either, whatever association you belong to, depending, because I know we have a wide scope of services, but they're going to have that information at the state level. And just because we're larger, sometimes that makes it even more complicated because we're trying to manage multiple states. So I think if you get engaged with your state association, that's huge. The other thing is invite your state elected officials out to your services. When they actually see how you're impacting the community and what you're doing and what is going to be missed in that community if you're no longer there, like the example with home health that Amy was sharing, that puts a face to it. And whether it's the actual individual, or it's, in some states they do have staffers, and they're just as important. Treat them just as if they were the member. Because they have a direct access to that elected official and can really have an impact. I think we have to do this also with our federally elected officials, because to Alicia's point and what Hemi said originally, these states do have to balance their budgets, unlike the federal government. And so the impacts that this is having on various states, depending on their situation, it's just miserable. It's not going to be good. And so that message needs to go back to the federal delegation, because the impacts that the states are going to have to implement are sometimes draconian.
Any questions for Tom or Amy? Right, well, we're running up on the hour here, and I do want to, first of all, thank Tom and Amy for their time and their wisdom, and Hemi as well. I see you're still here, and really appreciate all that you've brought to the conversation. A reminder that we'll capture the video, and you'll have access to the slides and everything. Also, we are at LSA launching the expansion of the policy committee, which had an initial focus on Medicaid, and now we're 20 members strong. Tom and Amy, I believe, are two of those, and we'll be now focusing on Medicaid, housing, and workforce, as well as technology and AI. And I have to say that with our office here right across the street from the Capitol, people do want to hear at a national level and in communities and at a state level from our united faith-based voice. And I think that's another thing that we've seen in states across, is that, leaning into your why of your work and joining in coalition, like Tom said, with broader groups, but also if there are other faith organizations in your community, that we have an outsized voice, and we're going to continue to lean into it. So kudos to Sarah and Sue and Bill and the Public Relations and Government Affairs team and all the policy committee members for that launch, and more to come on that. I'm sure everyone here has signed up for the advocacy updates and alerts. I find them really they keep me spot on what I need to know when I need to know it. So thank you once again for the team. Feel free to share those with your team members, with your board members, with anybody that you really think can benefit from that bird's eye view of what's really impacting our work and the work of our communities. There's a lot to filter out these days, and I think the team does a great job of really getting us what we need to know when we need to know it in a very nonpartisan way. So I find that a very unique value. So thank you all for that. And, as I'm reflecting on our conversation and all of the challenges, right, everything from reduced provider payments to redetermination, which I think we haven't even really begun to see how that's going to affect the work that we do, to telehealth. We've been talking about that threat. I've been polling our members from across the country, and right now the really leading indicator is a lot of food insecurity is becoming a really growing issue in our members across the deck. It's almost like the canary in the coal mine of the impacts of these cuts. And so, there's a lot of work to do. It's really core to our mission. And I just want to thank each and every one of you on the Zoom screen here for all that you bring to your work and your communities. And, we do have a lot of work to do. But the good news is we're going to be doing this together. So thank you all for your time. And
Yes. Yep.
Sarah has a little bit more to
Yep.
say.
And just want to launch our closing poll. Hopefully folks can see that. This is just to kind of gauge if we move the needle and who understood a little bit more, got a little bit more knowledge. As we're letting folks do that, again, want to say thank you so much for your participation today, for our engagement with our speakers, Hemi, Tom, and Amy. And as we mentioned, we hope you'll join us on our community platform in general, but also those of you here on this call have an interest in, at least at some level, in our advocacy work. So we hope you would be interested in joining our advocacy leads group. That doesn't have to mean you're the only person or even the top person doing advocacy for your organization, but if you want to be in those conversations, we'll share the link and the information about how to sign up for that in our follow-up email. And reminder, our next webinar in this series is on November 20th. And we plan to at this point, we plan to focus on workforce issues and how that's shaping out and shaping up. So just please remember to save the calendar invites. It's a recurring event. It's the same Zoom link, so you'll always have that. So we look forward to sharing the follow-up with you. Thank you so much. It seems like we got some good movement forward on our understanding. So we appreciate that and look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.